Earlier this week, we released the J Area Wrestling podcast that centered all around Paul Heyman, who I think is one of the more influential and revolutionary characters in professional wrestling, not only for his contributions behind the scenes, but basically for the role of that of a manager, a character that really hasn't been explored in recent times in pro wrestling. The role of the manager really is to highlight that of their client, the wrestler in which we're trying to get over. For today's Friday 5 count, let's go ahead and let's dive into my 5 favorite professional wrestling managers of all time. Before we begin the list, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to make sure that you are a member of the exclusive club that is the J Area Wrestling Podcast. And with that being said, let's go and let's jump right into it at number 5 with Miss Elizabeth. Now, Miss Elizabeth is one of the more iconic characters in professional wrestling, mostly due to her presence alongside the Macho Man Randy Savage. What was a real-life marriage turned into an on-screen marriage. Miss Elizabeth's presence was always felt, whether it was with Macho Man, the NWO, or even Lex Luger. But what Miss Elizabeth really stood for was a huge jump in terms of progress for women in pro wrestling. A lot of times, the female aspect of professional wrestling wasn't always graciously presented the way it is nowadays. Miss Elizabeth broke barriers by being that of a smart, capable woman in a fierce world that was dominated by males. Miss Elizabeth, I thought, brought class to pro wrestling. A lot of people thought it was savagery. They thought these were just guys hitting each other over the head with steel chairs. But Miss Elizabeth always being able to ground the Macho Man. Macho Man was one of those larger than life characters, and I've always felt like Miss Elizabeth was the one to really ground him as a character. She was a huge part of his development as a heel, as he would verbally have tirades against her, always yelling at her, directing her where to go. And then as a babyface, when at WrestleMania 7, the Macho Man reunites with Miss Elizabeth, providing this huge emotional moment for the fans in attendance and watching all around the world. Miss Elizabeth is the standard bearer when it comes to women managers in the WWE and just pro wrestling in general. And I feel like we owe her a lot of gratitude for the steps that have been made for women in pro wrestling. That's why one day I'm hoping that the WWE elects her to be a member of its Hall of Fame. Number 4, I have Paul Bearer, surely one of the more iconic figures in pro wrestling. He has a character and a face that you could never forget. He's been alongside likes of The Undertaker, Kane, and Mankind, being involved in some of the biggest storylines in professional wrestling, whether it was the Kane and Undertaker saga, whether it was the Ministry of Darkness. Paul Bearer always had a presence, just like Miss Elizabeth, whenever he was on the screen. He, of course, had a long career, but really was centered around the Undertaker and Kane saga. So for me, because of his influence not only in the WWF and WWE, I'd like to include him on this list, but because there wasn't much variety when it came to his clients, that's why he reaches at number 4. Up next, we have Jimmy Hart, the Mouth of the South, who was a key player in the wrestling 80s boom that helped put them on the map, certainly during the early years of WrestleMania. Jimmy Hart, for me, was always that great wrestling heel who had that loud mouth, who always had something to say and had the high-pitched voice, had the animated antics, and alongside a roster of superstars that are second to none. Many of these guys are in the Hall of Fame. People like Bret the Hitman Hart, Jim Neidhart, the Honky Tonk Man, Jerry the King Lawler, the Giant, also known as the Big Show, Harley Race, and even Hulk Hogan himself during the WCW days. Jimmy Hart was that type of character who I think a lot of people associated with the rock and wrestling era of professional wrestling. And you look at the list of names that I just named off, that's not even included his short-lived tag team sport with Money Inc., IRS, and Ted DiBiase, and I also forgot to mention the Nasty Boys. This guy had so many clients, so many talented individuals who would go on to be Hall of Famers or should be Hall of Famers already. Now, between number 2 and number 1, it really is a toss-up depending on the day in which I'm thinking about this list. But it ultimately comes down to personal preference. That's why it's my personal 5 count. So for this video, at number 2, I have Bobby the Brain Heenan, surely to be considered one of the greatest managers of all time, and in many cases the greatest manager of all time, depending who you ask. Not only was he a performer in the ring, but he was a performer outside the ring. He was a commentator, he was an interviewee, he was a manager. Anytime I saw Bobby the Brain Heenan on TV, I knew for sure we were going to get some kind of quippy one-liner or some kind of memorable moment that would leave us laughing or hating him, in essence. He also has been associated with huge names. I mean, a who's who's. If you thought Jimmy Hart had a great list of a roster, wait until you hear Bobby the Brain Heenan. We have a long list here. We have Paul Orndorff, Big John Studd. We have Harley Race, King Kong Bundy, Rick Rude, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard. We also have Lex Luger, Haku, Mr. Perfect, Andre the Giant, Ric Flair. A who's who of talent. Bobby the Brain Heenan also had a very popular and quite frankly iconic line of his own. He says, "You listen to me, you go to the top. You don't listen to me, and you're never heard from again." Bobby the Brain Heenan, I think, for many reasons, not only for the client list that he has, but his level of presence, the way he was able to elevate the stars he was with, and essentially elevating himself as well due to association. Bobby the Brain Heenan is the standard when it comes to what an old school and traditional manager should be. But of course, at number one, I have Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman, who revolutionized the business because of his contributions to ECW. That is a huge proponent as to why I think he's such a successful man in the business of professional wrestling. But then when you look at the list of talent that he's been associated with, let's start with just the WWE. You look at the names like Kurt Angle, The Big Show, RVD Rob Van Dam, Brock Lesnar, CM Punk, and of course Roman Reigns as a member of the Bloodline. That list in itself is some of the greatest talent of all time. When Paul Heyman had a client, they were usually a world champion. Then you go back to the WCW days with the Dangerous Alliance, where he had guys like Rick Rude, Arn Anderson, Larry Zbyszko, Stunning Steve Austin. He even spent a short time with Mark Calloway, who would later go on to be The Undertaker. Under the tutelage of Dusty Rhodes, Paul Heyman understood the business. He knew what it meant to get someone over and to maintain the attention of a craving audience. Paul Heyman, to this day, still very active in the business. So if you don't think Paul Heyman's number one right now, I think in a few years, that will change your mind, because he's constantly being presented as a credible force in the WWE and just professional wrestling in general. But of course, that's just my list. I'd love to hear from you guys on who you believe is the number one greatest manager of all time, or maybe some guys that I didn't even mention on my list today. Go ahead and sound off in the comments, like the video, share the video, and subscribe to the J Area podcast as well as my YouTube channel in order to keep up to date with all wrestling content such as this one here today. Of course, my name is Jose Ramos Jr. Thank you for stopping by on this Friday 5 count, and we'll see you guys in the next video.